Morning. Go ahead. We're going to read several verses from Exodus chapter 20 in a few moments. So if you want to go ahead and open your Bibles there, you can. Exodus chapter 20. And there are several announcements I forgot to make, things just to bring you aware of, prayer requests mainly. So I want to make those at this time. My wife will tell you that beginning now, everything kind of shifts gears and start thinking about Honduras, and so I forget other things, and so I wrote these down during worship. But Jeanette Young is not with us this morning. She's down on her back. She has spent a little bit of time in the emergency room. She's not in the hospital now, but remember her, and if you got her phone number, give her a call. Let her know that you love her. So Jeanette's been in the hospital. Dee Dee was in the hospital for a few days with some heart problems, and so remember her in our prayers as you go throughout your week as well. Also, don't forget that today at 2 o'clock is the second service for Empowerment Community Church. Pastor Walter, last Sunday was great, and so if you're not doing anything and you want to come back at 2, come back and join us for that. And then this afternoon, our Jobs for Life class wraps up in both the men and women's jails in Davidson County, and so we have our graduation, and there's a total of 18 people who will graduate with their certificates for Jobs for Life. And so remember those as well, and the champions and the mentors who are serving with them. So I think that's everything that I forgot to say earlier. God's stress management plan. This is the fourth week that we looked at stress. We're talking about how to overcome, not necessarily how to alleviate it, because you're always going to have it, but how to deal with stress. And mainly, and I'll mention these in a second, there's kind of 6 attitudes that we have that I think cause stress in our life. And for every one of those attitudes, there's a principle from God's Word that when we apply it to those things, then our stress level will reduce. And so, God's stress management plan. Have you ever been challenged to keep a detailed record of how you spend your time during a typical week? Has that ever happened? You know, maybe at work you were asked to do that, or maybe it's a school project. When I was in graduate school, we were challenged to do that. And so 1 week during graduate school, my project that we all had was to keep a record of how I spent my time during a typical week, and to be as detailed about that as you possibly could. And so I took on that challenge, and the purpose was to evaluate our time management skills, or our lack thereof, one way or the other. You know, how do we spend our time? I know in our minds, we say this is how we spend our time, but to actually document every 15 minutes, basically, if I remember right, to break it down into every 15 minutes over the course of the week, what were you doing and how you spent your time, just to see how you were going. And so here's what I learned during that week. If you calculate it out, there are 168 hours in a week. No one has more than that. No one has less than that. We all have the exact amount of time. 168 hours in a week. And so during that particular week, after I kept up with it, I found out that I spent 68 hours at work and other church-related things. At the time, I was teaching at Nashville State. No, I wasn't teaching at this time. So that was all church-related. And so I spent 68 hours at work and other church-related functions, and that equals out to about 40% of your time. 40% of the 168 hours. I spent 55 hours sleeping. Now, I enjoyed that part of my week, right? Now, if you calculate that out, you can see that that's over 7 hours a week. I do pretty good at I don't do good in a lot of things, but I do pretty good at trying to make sure that I get around that 7 hours a night of sleep that's recommended for optimal health. And so I did pretty good on that, I thought. I spent 20 hours that week in interaction with my family. Now, that's just 12% of the time. So I was a little embarrassed about that. It didn't seem like it was enough compared to other things. I spent 15 hours in recreation. I think at the time I was playing basketball at the Y, and you know, I could probably start playing again. Now, instead of shooting a basketball, I have a basketball in my midsection, so I need to get rid of that. And you know, but so that was about 9% of my time. And then roughly 10 hours on just kind of personal things or miscellaneous. I didn't know where to put it. And that was about 6% of my time. But if you were to do that, what would your week look like? How much of your time would be spent at work? If you work a 40-hour week, that would be about 24% of your time. An 80-hour work week then would be about 48 hours. But what would your work life look like? How much of your time would you say you spent with your family or personal time or et cetera and all that thing? But here's the question for us today. Where would God fit in that schedule? How much time over 168 hours would you spend in the things of God? Well, where did God fit in my schedule? Well, you can't really count the 68 hours that was kind of church work related, but just that personal one-on-one time with God. Well, if anyone could do this, if you added up, if you were a really, quote, really good Christian, all right? And so over the typical week, if you added up time at church and time in Bible study and time in small groups and service opportunities and daily devotions and all of that, it would still equal less than 1% of your time. You see, 1%. And so what if we decided we were going to tithe on our time? 10%. Well, 10% of the total hours during the week, if you round it up, would equal 17 hours or 2.5 hours a day if you round it up. You see, we say God is important, but chances are all of us give him less than 1% of our time. No wonder we're stressed out. Everyone I know keeps a hectic schedule. Moms get up at the break of dawn to get their kids ready for school or daycare, and herself and her dad ready for work. And then if the mom doesn't work outside the home, there's more work to do inside the home than any one human being can possibly undertake. If she works outside the home, then after work, she's got to rush and pick up the kids and speeds home to prepare dinner before soccer or ballet practice. After supper, it's time to clean up the kitchen, straighten up the house, give the children a bath, read a bedtime story, get clothes ready for the next day so that the whole thing can be repeated again, day after day after day. I saw a sign, somebody put it on Facebook, and it was a school, since school's out. And this school had a lot of guts. This school put on their sign out front for summer vacation, it said, "Parents, tag, you're it." You know. And then just pick up the process over and over again. Dad goes off to work where he will spend 8 to 12 hours at a job he endures but doesn't really enjoy. Then he comes home, tries to eat supper real quick, and then tries to tackle the leaky faucet or some other home repair, and they are never ending, are they not? He stops working long enough to try to go watch his son play baseball or his daughter march in the school band. He had plans to do something with the family this weekend, but the boss told him he had to work both Saturday and Sunday this weekend and didn't tell him till Friday afternoon. He can't remember the last time that he really had a full weekend off. And so whether you're a man working as many hours as possible to provide for the family, a woman trying to maintain a career and keep her family going, a teenager involved in schoolwork, sports, music, and scouts, we have become a people who are just simply workaholics. Our schedules are full, and often one of the first things that goes when our schedule gets full is church. Now, let's be honest. Don't raise your hand because it would probably make me cry. But let's be honest. How many of you had such a stressful, awful 6-hour work week, you would have given anything if you could have just slept in this morning? But something told you to get up. You know, this is my only day off, and I've got to go to church. Thank God we don't have to tear down, right? At least I've got some kind of break. Faithfully keeping the Sabbath seems to be a thing of the past, outdated and irrelevant in our lives. The result is stress. There are two types of stress. These are medical terms for stress. Two types of stress. One type comes from the Latin word eustress, or eustress, and that simply means good stress. Now, there are things in our life that are good that stress us out. For example, it could be you have to give a presentation at work, and you've been anxious about it, and it's caused you stress, and the night before your presentation, you are anxious, but the speech or the presentation goes well, and afterwards you relax because you know you did a decent job. Eustress motivated you. It kept you energized. It made you nervous. And it was short-lived, and that was the key. It was short-lived. The tired you felt when it was all over was a good tired. That's over with. And you relax. The second type of stress comes from the Latin word distress. And that's bad stress. And basically, the difference between the two is a whole lot of eustress becomes distress. Bad stress is a piling on of several good stresses without allowing your body and mind time to rest and recuperate. Are you following me? And so you've got something going on that's a positive thing, and you're stressed about it, but it keeps you energized, it keeps you motivated, and when it's over, you relax. But when it's over, if immediately there's something else that stressed you out, and then immediately there's something else that stressed you out, and you go days and days and days and days without being able to take a break from the stress, then it becomes bad. Constantly being under stress is harmful to your physical, spiritual, and emotional well-being. So, the lifestyles that produce negative stress in our lives can be summarized by these 6 words or philosophies that we're looking at. Today's the third word, and we'll have 3 more. But here are those attitudes or philosophies: hedonism, individualism, workaholism, self-sufficiency-ism, success-ism, and selfishness-ism, to keep that going. And we can overcome those stress by replacing those attitudes with the biblical principles of self-control, community, remembering the Sabbath, meditation, priorities, and service. And so we've looked at 2. Today I want us to talk about the third stress abuser, and that's workaholism, which is a made-up word. My computer did not like me this week because it kept red underlining that word. But workaholism, that is the stress. That's the attitude that gets us under stress. And the stress buster is to remember the Sabbath. In other words, honoring the Sabbath is God's stress management plan. There is a reason He asked us to do this. Abusing or neglecting the Sabbath is the surest way on earth to add to your levels of stress, to just keep going on and on and on and on and on without taking a break. Now, work is ordained by God and is not a result of sin. Did you get that? Adam and Eve were working in the garden before they sinned. And so work is not a sin. It's not a result of sin. In fact, the Bible teaches that there will be work in heaven. That there will be something for you to do. You're not going to be sitting around on a cloud playing a harp all the time. But you'll have an assignment. You'll have something that you do that will benefit everyone else. The curse of work was the burden of work and the not enjoying the work and getting burned out and all of that. But God created us to work, you see. Retirement is not in the Bible. Now, that doesn't mean you can't retire from your job, but what that means is once you retire from your job, then God says, okay, I've got something else for you to do now with all that free time. You see. God made us to work, and all work is ultimately God's work. Colossians chapter 3, verse 23 says this, whatever you do, and in the context, he's talking about work, Paul is. And he says, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord, not men. That boss that gets on your nerves is not your boss. God is your boss, you see. And what he has said is, you work as hard as you can and be the best worker you can be, even if that guy's a jerk, you see. Because you're working for God. And so God expects us to be hard workers, but he doesn't expect us to work ourselves to death. God created us to work, but he also created us to rest. He even gave us a word that turns rest from a verb to a noun. And that word is Sabbath. The problem is we have abused the balance between work and rest and have become workaholics. So here's a definition of what I'm talking about. Workaholism, again, that's a made-up word. Workaholism could be defined as the dependence on overwork that has a noticeable adverse effect on the rest of your life. In other words, you're working so much that the rest of your life starts to deteriorate. Now, there are three things that characterize a workaholic. First, a workaholic is a perfectionist. You say, well, that counts me out. No. There's two. If we had time, I'd go person to person and say, and I could tell you if you're a perfectionist or not, because there's two ways you know if somebody's a perfectionist. All I'd have to do is ask yourself, how clean is your bedroom? Or if you own the house, how clean is your house? And a perfectionist either has a really, really clean house or a really, really messy house. Because the perfectionist says, I'm going to do it perfect. And if I can't do it perfect, I just ain't going to do it at all. One or the other. But a workaholic is a perfectionist. Everything has to be done right, and they think that they're the only ones who can do it right. And so the attitude of a workaholic is, I would rather do it myself than to have someone else do it and mess it up, and then I got to come behind and do it for them. The perfectionist thinks that the company cannot survive without their input. If they was to fire me, this whole place would fall apart. Well, you might walk in tomorrow and decide they want the whole place to fall apart. Your spouse expresses her need to spend more time with you, and a perfectionist or the workaholic responds by saying, okay, I'll do that. I'll stay home tonight, but I just want you to know I'm going to pay for it tomorrow at work. You see? And so a workaholic is a perfectionist. A workaholic is restless. When not working, they can't sit still. When not at work, their minds are preoccupied with all the things that need to be done at work. Guilty. Many times for a workaholic, the longest week of the year is vacation. They don't have anything, they just can't wait. They gripe and complain about their job 51 weeks out of the year, and then that 52nd week when they're on vacation, they can't wait to get back into the mess. A workaholic can't simply relax. They're a perfectionist, they're restless, and then they're relentless. They maintain a frantic schedule. They are the first ones to arrive at work and the last ones to leave. They are preoccupied with performance and find it difficult to refuse additional responsibilities. They just can't say no. Now, here is the problem with this. Oddly enough, our society admires that type of individual. Workaholism is an accepted addiction. Now think about that. You want the alcoholic to get better. You want the drug addict to get better. But a workaholic, he's a good guy. We even think it's Christian to work harder and longer than everyone else. But this is not healthy, and it produces distress. And so what's the antidote? Well, the antidote is to remember the Sabbath. British philosopher Bertrand Russell put it this way, and I love this. He said, one of the symptoms of an approaching nervous breakdown is the belief that one's work is terribly important. You see, workaholism causes stress. The answer is to remember the Sabbath. Look at Exodus chapter 20. Exodus chapter 20 is the 10 Commandments. The fourth commandment is the commandment to remember the Sabbath. But I want you to notice something when we read this fourth commandment. It is the longest commandment. God spends more time talking about remembering the Sabbath than he does any other commandment. Now, do you find that strange? Don't you think he spent a lot of time talking about adultery? Or he'd spend a lot of time talking about lying and stealing? But apparently God knows us pretty well. And he knows that we most of us might be pretty good at keeping 9 of the 10. And we think 90% is a passing grade, right? But he probably knows the hardest commandment for you to keep is this one. And so I got to go a little bit extra in explaining it. And so look what he says. Exodus chapter 20, verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your manservant or maidservants, nor your animals, nor the alien within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath, and he made it holy. The word remember in verse 8 means to impress on your mind. The idea is to observe without lapse or to hold as a present and continuing priority. The word Sabbath literally means rest. The word holy means to set apart. And so in the fourth commandment, God is saying, observe without ceasing 1 day a week for rest. Set this day apart for me as holy. Now, for the Israelites, this day was Saturday. But why? Well, because God created the world in 6 days and then he rested on the seventh, and so that's Saturday. Now, think about this. Did God need 6 days to create the world? You see, God could have created the world in 1 day, could he not? He could have done it in a moment of time or in an instant. But he chose to work 6 days and rest 1 day because he was trying to give us an example to follow. Now, because Jesus rose from the grave on Sunday, the Christian tradition has been that the Sabbath be the first day of the week, Sunday. And so ideally, I'll get to it in just a second, but ideally, Sunday should be set apart to God as a holy day. Now, some people say this, when you talk about that's the Old Testament, it's impractical. There's no way that a person can keep the Sabbath like you're talking about. Well, here's the answer to that. The Israelites, if you remember, were in the desert, wandering around when God gave them this commandment. In other words, for the Israelite, every day was survival. They didn't have homes to live in. They just every day was survival. To take 1 day off in 7 would be suicidal. The point is this: it's a lot easier to keep this commandment today than it would have been for the Israelites to keep it in their day. Now, in the New Testament, Jesus got himself in trouble with the Pharisees. Do you remember this story? Because on the Sabbath, he picked grain out of the grain field and gave it to his disciples to eat. And so on the Sabbath, Jesus worked. And the Pharisees got upset because he worked. The Pharisees criticized him. But Jesus replied in Mark chapter 2, verse 27. Do you remember this? This is key. Jesus said the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. In other words, Jesus was saying the Sabbath is for our benefit, not his. Now, if for whatever reason, and I know there are reasons, but if for whatever reason a person can't take Sunday off, and sometimes people go through periods of time where their work demands it, or they're in the emergency type fields. There's various reasons why some people, out of necessity, they can't take Sundays off. Well, what Jesus is saying is, he says in another place that the Sabbath really isn't any particular day. But what he's saying is, look, you've got to figure it out. You cannot keep going. You have got to spend one day a week. Make that day holy and rest and renew yourself. Ideally Sunday. But if it's not Sunday, you got to find another day. Because let me be honest with you, the people who violate the Sabbath, working on Sundays more than anybody else, are pastors. I ain't kept Sunday as a Sabbath in 30 plus years. Right? I violate it every week if you want to be legalistic about it. And so it's important that I find another day where it's like, this is God and me time. Because you see, it's not about God. It's about us. And so God instituted the Sabbath day for our benefit, not his. Or to put it another way, the Sabbath doesn't need us. We need the Sabbath. You see. When I was in college, I had to spend 2 years studying biblical Greek. I've forgotten all of it, but I spent 2 years. During my second year of Greek, Dr. Piccirilli was my professor. Now, Dr. Piccirilli, most of you don't know him, but Dr. Piccirilli is one of the top biblical scholars in the world. He helped translate the New King James Version. Very few people in the world know biblical Greek better than he does. There were about 8 of us in that class that particular year. So one day, as we were going over our translations, it became obvious that no one had done their homework, including me. Have you ever not got your homework done? You think, well, other people do it, so it'll be okay. No one did their homework. So Dr. Piccirilli was frustrated. And he became a little bit angry. And he closed his Greek New Testament with a thud. And he sternly said to us, he said, look, I don't need this class. I already know it all. This class is for you, not me. And when you and I neglect the Sabbath, I think God gets frustrated. It breaks his heart. And I believe he says to us, look, I don't need a day of rest. I am God. I own every day. I'm doing this for you. And when you neglect and abuse this day, you are not hurting me, God says. You're only hurting yourself. So why did God institute a Sabbath day? Be it Sundays for most of us, or, why did he institute this and say you have got to take time off? Why did he do that? Well, I think he did it for 2 reasons. First, God instituted the Sabbath for our physical rest. You and I need rest. We were not created to work 7 days a week, 365 days a year. We just weren't created that way. And God knows when we are overworked, we cannot be the husbands and fathers and wives and mothers and friends or even the employees that we need to be. And so he says, look, rest. We are not the Energizer Bunny. Our batteries will wear down if we do not stop and rest and we get sick. I've said this before and I believe it with all my heart. Sometimes the most spiritual thing you can do is take a nap. Not right now, later on. But just rest. A second reason God instituted the Sabbath was for our spiritual renewal. We need to stop one day a week to rest and consider God's place in our lives. Where does he fit? We say he's important, but if we never stop and take a day off to recognize him, what are we really saying? When you have already worked 6 days, to work one more day is to place your job ahead of your relationship with God. You are saying, I have to take care of myself. I can't even trust God to meet my needs. I've got to go to work again. I got to make that money. I got bills to pay. Honoring the Sabbath keeps your priorities straight. It's a weekly reminder that your life is in God's hands. It's a weekly reminder that every day belongs to him. And so we're to dedicate one day a week to God for rest and renewal because of what he has done for us. We need to rest physically, and we need to renew ourselves spiritually. And the longer we go between pit stops, the more stress builds up in our lives. I've tried to instill in my kids, because my father-in-law, more than my father, instilled this in me, that the best way to take care of your car is to change the oil regularly. Because if you don't, all that gunk gets built up, and eventually it'll ruin the entire motor. But if you just simply, every 3,000 miles, take it to the dealer or do it yourself and just change the oil, it'll last a long time. The Sabbath is like that. We run 3,000 miles a week in our lives. And if we don't stop and get all that gunk out, eventually it'll ruin the rest of our lives. Keeping the Sabbath has more to do than where you spend Sunday mornings. Please hear me on that. Keeping the Sabbath has more to do with where you spend Sunday mornings. It has to do with living a balanced, healthy life. It has to do with our being totally dependent on God to meet our needs. It has to do with our very relationship to God. The purpose of the Sabbath is not to get us to think, the purpose of the Sabbath is to get us to think about God all week long, not just one day a week. So how can you take advantage of the Sundays or the Sabbath and reduce the stress in your life? Well, again, I come into church, and it's always a waste of time about talking about church attendance on Sunday. That's a waste of time because you're here. But we got to make church a top priority in our life. You don't wait until Saturday night or Sunday morning to decide you're going to church. You decide that you're going to church next Sunday right now. It's top priority. You take advantage of Sundays by spending time with your family, so you don't waste Sundays. Use that time to spend with your family, doing things that you enjoy, building relationships. This is always important, but it's really important, I think, when your kids are young, but it's always important. But spending that time together. And then third, you take advantage of this by other Sabbaths besides Sunday. Now, taking other Sabbaths besides Sunday is incredibly important if you work on Sundays. You know, the ox in the ditch, Jesus talked about that. That, if the ox is in the ditch and it's on the Sabbath, you got to get the ox out of the ditch. But if you got an ox in the ditch every Sunday, you got to start asking yourself some questions. What's wrong with my ox? You see. Something's going on. Yeah, there are emergencies that come up. But in the Old Testament, God not only commanded a weekly Sabbath, but he also commanded yearly Sabbaths, 7-year Sabbaths, and 49-year Sabbaths. And so there are other things besides just one day a week. And so what God was saying was, look, you need to take one day a week off. You need to do this, but you got to do it more than just one day a week. And so we got to schedule other times throughout the year for special days of rest and renewal. Right? Look, let's be honest. You got so much to do, you ain't going to get it all done anyway, so taking a weekend off every now and then is not going to hurt anything. Taking a week off, it's all going to be there when you get back. It's not going, none of your work buddies are going to say, don't worry while you're gone, I'm going to finish all your work. It'll be there when you get back, so don't worry about it. And so we have to take other Sabbaths. So besides Sundays, if you can, take another half day off every once in a while, every week. To renew yourself physically and spiritually. Schedule one day a month for the same thing. All right, I want to get away. I got to slow down. I'm doing too much. Now, this includes church work. Let me tell you a dirty secret. Not long ago, we had an incredibly busy week around here. And then we had an incredibly busy Saturday. Some people did, doing a great job serving some people in the community that needed to be served. And it was an all-day thing. At the end of the day, there was about 5 of us around. And you know, we're all part of this church. It was about 5, you may think I'm crazy, but it was about 5 of us around. And I looked at the people who were there after everybody was gone, and the last ones there who were helping clean up and do all that stuff. I looked at those 5 people and I said, look, you don't need my permission, but I want you to know, you got my permission to stay home tomorrow. You've got to rest. You see. What? A pastor told somebody not to come to church on Sunday? Yeah, I did. Stay home tomorrow. You got to rest because Monday's coming and you're going to be right back at it again. And you used all of your time today. You know. Now, some of them took advantage of that, but some of them, they came to church anyway. What are you doing here? You see. You got to schedule other times. A half a day off every once in a while. Take a day off a month. Plan a weekend a quarter. And take a week off every year. Vacations are so important. Even if you can't afford to take one, take one. Recognize that time to rest and renew is an important aspect of your relationship with God and your family. Are you under a tremendous amount of stress? Right now, you just feel that I can't take it anymore. Well, have you neglected the Sabbath? You say, no, I've been at church every Sunday. That's not what I'm talking about. Have you neglected the Sabbath? Have you been working too hard and not taking other time off for yourself? Say, man, I hadn't had a vacation in 20 years. Well, guess what? You sinned. You see, if I understand the scripture right. Don't brag about that. Man, nobody brags about having an adultery. Take a day off. Make a commitment to start honoring the Sabbath again. I'm telling you, doing so will help reduce stress. It's God's stress management plan. Keep the Sabbath. Keep the Sabbath. Take care of yourself physically. Take care of yourself spiritually. Honor me by keeping the Sabbath. Let's pray. Father, I stand before these people and in your presence and admit that at times in my life I've been out of balance and have violated this principle. And here your word tells us, look, this is not for you. Your word says keep the Sabbath. It's for your benefit, not mine. So Lord, help me to take that to heart. Father, help us to realize that you care for us deeply. So much so that you modeled for us. You didn't have to, but you modeled for us that we cannot just continue to go. That we have to stop and renew ourselves physically and renew ourselves spiritually and to honor you by giving just a portion of our time. Lord, remembering the Sabbath is a confession that every day belongs to you, that our lives belong to you, that our work belongs to you, that our families belong to you. Everything belongs to you. So help us to do that. Lord, if some of us have been overworking and we're just stressed out beyond limit, we don't know what to do, and we're about to break, Lord, renew our strength today. Help us to get our priorities straight. Help us to see what's really important in life. Lord, renew us again physically and spiritually. And we'll give you the praise and the honor and the glory. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. If you would stand with me and let's say our prayer for the year together. Repeat this with me. As we leave this place of worship and fellowship, let us commit ourselves to love and serve God by loving and serving our neighbors. You're dismissed.